Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm Andrew Musgrove and today I'm joined by Dave Powell. Dave is our football money man here at Reach PLC and keeps an eye and a calculator across all of the big talking points when it comes to the Premier League and club finances. In today's episode, we're going to try and understand a bit more about Newcastle United and how they are handling the PSR restrictions and whether the change that is coming is a good thing for Newcastle United. We've had plenty of questions sent in by you guys already, so I will put as many as I can to Dave. Please remember to hit thumbs up on YouTube, hit subscribe as well, and leave us a rating and review on the audio platform. Let's get on with the show. Dave, welcome. Thank you for spending the time with us today. How are you keeping?
Really well, thanks, Andrew. It's thanks for the invite. It's first time on the Black and White, so it's pleased to be on here, and it's so much to kind of chew over with Newcastle. I think it's such a fascinating club and such a fascinating time. Pleased to dive into it.
We're pleased to get your knowledge and expertise on the matter, because I have to say I'm pitiful with numbers, and there's so many twists and turns when it comes to football finance that does hurt my head slightly more than GCSE maths. So how easy is it for
I wasn't
you?
great at that, I've got to be honest.
Well, now I'm concerned.
I've improved since, so don't worry.
How easy is it for you, though, to look at the accounts that you do, not just Newcastle but across the Premier League, and make sense of it all?
I don't know. It's one of those things. It's I found. I say this to anyone who listen whenever I talk about this role. It's there's a difference between knowing Pythagoras' theorem and being able to understand a football club's balance sheet. You know, if I would have had, if there would have been a kind of a reference point for me of kind of looking at something I enjoyed when I was at school. So if I was looking at football club accounts instead of looking at the what an isosceles triangle, I would have engaged far more. But no, it's I think it's for some clubs it's easier. For others, probably Chelsea, I would add into that mix. It can be a little more challenging because there's so many different companies involved. But yeah, ultimately there's kind of a very basic set of principles and parameters that give you an idea of kind of the financial health of our football clubs. And there are plenty of seasoned experts and accountants out there for me to lean on whenever I don't feel I've got a handle on the situation. But the Newcastle one we've followed the thread of, and it's I think there's some brighter skies really coming along the tracks.
Well, our listeners and viewers will be very happy to hear that. Given last year's numbers for Newcastle United and the fact that they were forced to sell Elliot Anderson and Yakuba Minter to avoid a PSR penalty, Eddie Howe has been very clear about that. He didn't want to sell them, but the club had no option. We're into the January transfer market, and yet again, they are very wary of any potential breach of PSR. Can you give us a rough prediction of where Newcastle United might be finding themselves at the moment financially?
Well, what they did last year in June, especially with the Anderson and Minte deals, was kind of accelerated those and brought them into the previous financial years of 23-24. Now, no club's been charged with a breach for 23-24, that 3-year rolling period. I mean, the Premier League confirmed as much a couple of weeks ago. The problem in doing that is that they've got rid of some players this financial year, but they've made no profits on any of those yet, which makes me think that they probably have to engage in some element of player sales, because the owners have been quite clear about player trading is something within the greater control of owners over competitive success. I mean, if you can effectively play a trade, you can very much improve your balance sheet. You only have to look at the likes of Brentford, Brighton and Hove Albion about what effective player trading looks like. But Newcastle, after there was the initial, we saw some heavy spend on Bruno Guimaraes, Alexander Isak, Sandro Tonali, etc. But really last year was one of having to cut their cloth accordingly. And that had an impact maybe on competitive success, because really when you're coming out of the champion, that when you make the Champions League the first time in a long while, what you want to be doing is moving from a position of strength and using that as leverage and making sure the next season is something where you follow on that trend, or you at least invest in trying to make that the norm as opposed to an outlier. So Newcastle weren't really able to do that this season. looking so much better. But the return of Tonali obviously is key to a lot of that, like having a new player, because he missed so much of last season, which was obviously a blow for the club and for him. But a lot of good work has been done in this past financial year to enable Newcastle to come to a position of strength. Now, there's some chatter that they will be a small profit made. There is a potential for that. They did very well on commercial deals, done well in terms of player trading in the 23-24 accounting period. And all this is important because it impacts what their 3-year cycle will look like. Now, we're entering the final year. So 24-25 is the final year of PSR. This is the final year that will be accounted for with this 3-year cycle. So for Newcastle, it's important because it will see the 2021-22 season when they made a heavy loss and they've 2 consecutive years around 73 million. One of those will drop off. So if they can make a small profit in 23-24, which I think they've got a good chance of, then all they've got to contend with is that 73 million 22-23 and another loss. They may well make a loss for 24-25, but some projections are that could be more than 80 million and they would still be within the realms of PSR. Now, the problem the club has to do is they don't want 2 years of inactivity and really in the transfer market. So this coming summer, they want to try and put themselves in a position. I think that's what they've tried to do over the past 12 months or so, is really address the balance sheet, what it looks like, the amount of headroom they have, without having to sell their best assets. And they haven't had to do that yet. They've still got Aleksandar Isak in the building. They don't want to be that club they don't want to be a club which is bringing players on to sell to other clubs. They want to be the club where it's a destination rather than part of the journey. So I think that's been part of the modus operandi for the past 12 months. And I think that they will fall under that 80 million or so threshold, what they may be allowed to lose this year, a final year of PSR, and I think they'll be fine. But they're probably going to need some player trading in order to give themselves the best chance in the summer to act earlier maybe than having to wait till the end of June or start of July to do that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see early sales in June and potentially an exit this month.
Because, this month, there's lots of talk about Newcastle needing 1, 2, maybe 3 players, but there's also an understanding or an acceptance from most that it might not happen. Eddie Howe, again, has been very clear that he doesn't expect much business at all, whether it be outgoing or incoming. And that hasn't gone down well with every Newcastle United fan, because they've looked back in the summer and they've seen talk of £60 million for Mark Gee, and then they ask, well, where's that money gone for this month? Is it fair to say, though, that without obviously knowing the inner workings of what's happening in the boardroom, there is some logic behind Newcastle United keeping their powder dry this month to ensure that they meet the PSR restrictions, and then in the summer they can spend that a little bit more?
Yes, because one thing you're looking at is it's risk and reward. So you are looking at, do we make the Champions League again? Will a signing here be significantly impactful for us to guarantee making Champions League football? If the answer is yes, then and the player is available, then maybe they make a move. But the reality is that players are very, very expensive in January. The market isn't great at the moment. Players are expensive because clubs don't want to sell them, because they're either fighting relegation or they're in a chase for European places or titles themselves. They don't want to lose their best assets, nor do they have to. They can wait till the summer to play a trade. But so Newcastle would have to pay a premium over and above. And I'm not too sure whether there's, that you would have to weigh up whether or not there is the risk of breaching PSR for a year and potentially getting a points deduction outweigh maybe getting a boost in terms of reaching the Champions League. I don't know. There's no guarantee of reaching the Champions League. It's kind of a bit of a logjam there, isn't it? It's after that, after third, fourth and below is kind of a bit of a free for all. And when you consider that Manchester City are now in the position of adding, and you would imagine they'll probably try and strong arm their way to a Champions League place next year. I wonder whether it's been a calculated decision to maybe look towards this has been a year or two of it's not been pain because the club have, this isn't pain for Newcastle United. Fans know what pain looks like. These are the good times still. So, but is it relative in terms of looking at, do we accept slightly less in terms of competitive success over last year and this year in order to put ourselves in the best position where we retain all our key players? They bat away offers for Isak and everyone and Gordon, etc. If they are able to retain their key players, then get to a position in the summer where they can add, like they did, if they can add players of the quality like they did with Isak, Gordon, Guimaraes, Tonali, players like that, if they can get to the position to do that in the summer, then they make themselves bona fide challenges for a top 4 spot for next year. And then it starts to become a team which you think this is now a genuine challenger every single season, as opposed to an outlier. So I think there's probably some to-ing and fro-ing, and I imagine there's some who may want to kind of put the pedal to the floor a little bit and maybe take a little element of risk this summer, this January, and bring in a player. But it's hard to find impactful players in January who without paying a huge amount, which is going to impact your position financially.
Well, you mentioned there the risk of a points deduction, and especially since the opening of the January transfer window, there's been more and more Newcastle United fans wondering whether the club, maybe not this month, but perhaps in the summer just gone, should have maybe spent a little bit of more money and then just taken a points deduction, or have a late scramble again in June to give them a better chance of finishing in the Champions League. Obviously, Forest had a 4-point deduction for a breach of £34 million and are now joint second in the Premier League, or third on goal difference. But you've kind of alluded to it there. It'd be a massive gamble to go down that road, wouldn't it? To spend big, accept a points deduction, or on the gamble of making the Champions League in the season that you do that.
Yeah, Everton have had a points deduction of 8, and they've still not been able to really make moves in the market, and they won't be able to until this summer when things start to turn around a little bit for them. The Forest situation, I understand the argument, but also I think we are also at a moment in time for them at the moment. It's got shades of Leicester under Ranieri. The team is a team which you wouldn't expect to be competing at the very top when you look at the sum of its parts. So I think it's just a moment in time. I think they're kind of riding the crest of a wave. I'm not sure whether it's because they took a hit and decided to be, to go over the PSR. Problem is, you still have to account for that overspend somewhere. It doesn't go away, once you've received the points deduction. And also, would it have made a kind of a huge difference? I'm not sure it would. This is a long game for the PIF at Newcastle. This isn't looking at this season or even next season. This is trying to make Newcastle a force to be reckoned with for years to come. Now, we've seen clubs previously, you have to look at United, who've just kind of spent frivolously over the past 10 years or so and achieved very little. You look at the squad they have there, it's it's kind of a testament to poor recruitment and poor efficiency and wasted money. And they are the biggest spenders in the Premier League over the past 10 years or so. And they've not had the you look at Liverpool, they've spent a fraction of what United have, and they're the best team in Europe. So I think that I don't know whether it would have been wise for them to do so. This is the last year of PSR. I think, like I say, this is a long game. I think they're wanting to get their balance sheet in a healthier position to be able to invest this summer. And when they get to the changeover of rules from the PSR to the squad cost ratio, which is going to be revenue against amortization costs, wages, severance pay, and player agents' money. I think once they want that ratio to be in line with what the Premier League and UEFA want, so they can invest to a greater extent, which they will be able to. It's just been a very, very challenging period for the PIF coming into Newcastle, wanting to spend, having the money to spend, but not being able to because of the rules and regulations surrounding that, which would see them docked points.
Yeah, and we'll talk about those changes that are coming down the line later in the show. I mean, I should have done this at the beginning of the episode, but can you just remind our listeners and viewers how PSR works and what the important figures are in terms of the calculations?
Yeah, so it's assessed over a 3-year period. So clubs are allowed to lose 105 million over that rolling 3-year period, provided it's owner guaranteed those losses. For Forest, part of the problem with the breach was the fact that in their 3-year period was a 13 million allowance for losses because they spent a season in the Championship. Now that falls off from next year, so they'll be able to spend to a greater degree if we were still, using the if we were carrying on for the longer term of PSR. So you're allowed 105 million pounds. You can make allowable deductions for investment in infrastructure, so the stadium, so Newcastle making any investment to the stadium or training ground, etc. That's all doesn't come into account. The women's team, community initiatives, and the academy. So all those things are allowable deductions. There was also allowable deductions for the impact of COVID, which varied among clubs in terms of what they deducted. So it basically gives clubs, it's over this 3-year period. They're allowed to lose money, yes, but once they take out these deductions, I think just looking at some kind of loose figures, which kind of Swiss Ramble presented on his blog, it was Newcastle had allowable deductions over the past 3 years of about 40 million, a little over, just through youth development, community, women's football, and investment in infrastructure. So that comes off what was a total loss or expected total loss of 139 million, but that includes a potential for a 7 million profit this year. So gives you an idea of Newcastle, where Newcastle were. So once you take away that 41 million, it gives you kind of Newcastle had a limit or a buffer of around 7 million in terms of PSR for this period up to 23-24. Now that will improve this year if they post a positive result. This is the final year. I just think they'll be looking to get through this and not have any issues with being docked points or being hobbled financially in 25-26 and before we move over to this new scenario. Now, it's not popular with everyone, PSR, because it's seen as being kind of hamstrings. I see some club hamstrung in terms of what they can do in the market. But clubs who are upwardly mobile, like Newcastle, like Aston Villa, like Nottingham Forest, there is the argument to say, why can't you spend to the same degree as Manchester United or Chelsea, etc. Reason being is that the numbers don't stack up in terms of the commercial revenues for these clubs are far higher, largely because their success financially over the previous decade or so has been predicated on their ability to continuously qualify for Europe. Now, Arsenal actually are one of the clubs who were at risk of falling outside that and weren't too far ahead of Newcastle because they spent since, I think, 2023 was their first time back in the Champions League since 2016, maybe. Now that was really impactful for their bottom line. So there's quite a gap between them and kind of Liverpool, United, Chelsea, City, etc. Now Newcastle are probably closest to maybe closing that gap with Arsenal, but PSR hasn't allowed them to really press ahead with what the PIF would have liked to achieve at Newcastle. But the next set of rules and regs may well afford them a little more room for manoeuvre to try and kind of find those marginal games, I suppose. It won't change the dynamic completely because everyone's revenues remain the same and you still have to grow revenue to spend, etc. It's still, the onus is on you to still manage your wage bill and keep commercial revenue rising and match day revenue rising. And when you've got Manchester United planning on a 100,000 seater stadium, which might increase their match day revenue by as much as kind of 90 or 100 million in years to come, the challenge is there for everyone. So, but for Newcastle, the most obvious way to improve their position is through player trading and also competitive success.
Yeah, I guess it just reaffirms the challenge of building a club with ambitions of wanting to challenge for the title, but it sits in that kind of gap between the elite and the rest.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the Premier League, I suppose, will will tell you that they want, or the elite clubs. So I hate using that term because it seems, but it is what it is. I mean, these clubs do have, or it's almost monopolise the league. Yes, we have the odd kind of Cinderella story like Leicester or Forest this year, but in the main, it's dominated by the same clubs. And I don't want to use the words cartel because it's wrong, but it is dominated by these clubs because their revenues are so big, and they love the idea of. I mean, the Premier League needs competition, it needs to thrive, it needs teams to be challenging. You can't just have the same rinse and repeat. It can't be La Liga, or the French top tier league. So, but the top clubs don't want, while they'll kind of humour a Forest, and how well they've done this season. They don't want them to be there making problems for them. They don't want Newcastle in the years to come to be there making genuine problems for them and really challenging their ability to get into Europe and the Champions League, because that is ultimately what. Yes, the title matters to 2 or 3 sides going into the season, but for 7 or 8, the goal is Champions League football, because that's where the money lies to be able to kind of keep these brands growing. And as we get new markets coming online, like the US, who have become more and more interested in the sport, there's more marketing opportunities for the brand, etc. They don't want clubs coming in and stepping on their toes and taking a slice of the pie. But that's what's going to happen. So I think the PAF are probably playing this smartly in the best way to achieve longer term success, as opposed to what we've seen at other clubs where it's kind of been spend heavily if they can, and then hope that the competitive success follows. I mean, you look at Everton, who came in, Farhad Moshiri came in, spent heavily on big players, at the time, and brought in a top quality manager in Carlo Ancelotti, and what that did eventually was put the club in the shadows for 5 years, and it's taken them a good long while to find their way out of it. And they've had to kiss a few frogs on the way, but I think now they're kind of out of the woods a little bit. But yeah, it's these things, these rules and regulations are designed to keep clubs in their box. But who is to determine what is, how much a club can spend if owners can guarantee these sums? Is someone there to tell the PIF, no, sorry, you can't spend all this money because we're worried about you? I don't think the PIF meeting their transfer instalment payments for players is as much of a problem when you manage, the best part of 700 billion in assets. But the rules are there to try and ensure competitive balance. But does it stifle competitiveness in the Premier League? I would argue that it probably does, and there's a better way of doing things.
I think it certainly does. I think when you look at the issue Newcastle United are in, Aston Villa to a certain degree, these teams who maybe go beyond the expectation, qualifying for the Champions League, for example, but then are forced to sell their best players to ensure they meet PSR restrictions. I think it's totally unfair, and it's funny what you say there about, in a way these rules are there to kind of keep the established order. You can see that by the fact that there were emergency meetings and what have you when Newcastle were taken over by the Public Investment Fund, and only in recent months has, thanks to Manchester City, a couple of those rules been deemed unlawful in the words of Manchester City. The full truth maybe is a little bit less black and white, but it's really interesting to see how those clubs reacted. And you're talking about changes coming down the line, and there are a few changes coming down the line. I mean, first off, the rules on kind of sponsorships made by companies linked to the owners. I mean, what do you make of what happened a few months ago with Man City's legal case and their claimed victory on that?
Not much changed in terms of what happened with those link companies. The biggest win that City had was kind of proving to a panel that shareholder loans should be included in kind of financial regulation calculations, which is kind of impactful for a few teams. Certainly would have been for Everton at the time. I think as we move forward, I mean, Newcastle have had to be very clever. I mean, because the club has grown competitively and they've improved significantly, it goes hand in hand with them being able to. So the Champions League, for instance, was a real win when you think about branding, because really, if you're a champion, if you've qualified for the Champions League, you can use that as leverage to ask for more money from sponsors and commercial partners, and that's there's a huge array of potential partners that Newcastle could bring in for significant money, and it is telling that the Premier League kind of really had to scramble for the biggest clubs because they were so concerned when the PAF took over that this was going to happen. But City have been leaning on those kind of simpatico relationships that exist in the Middle East for a long time, and it's because they've managed to achieve competitive success. It's been less apparent because the revenues have been going up. They've been prize money's poured in the hundreds of millions, so you would expect to be able to charge high money for or big money for these kind of commercial partnerships. Now Newcastle, yes, they made the Champions League a couple of years back, but they're probably going to have to. There is a greater need for them to achieve competitive success to keep on making those rise. But there hasn't been a great change in terms of that relationship between related parties, etc. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Manchester City's 115 charges. Obviously, there's a lot of historic arguments around financial irregularities there, all alleged, of course. But I think there seems to be some. I don't know whether the Haaland 10-year deal should be instructive in terms of their confidence around that. But I think again, like I keep on saying, I think the PIF's doing things by piecemeal, bit by bit, is probably the way to go to get the club to a point where these bigger deals are the norm. We're going to see commercial revenues have already increased significantly at Newcastle from where they were previously. So what was 2022, 23? I've just got figures here. So it's 250 million. There's some estimates for 23, 24 that it's going to be closer to 300 million, which would be, you're looking at almost a 50 million rise there. They're not going to be able to achieve that year on year, but I think in going back to some of the deals that they had previously around, I think we've seen the end of the days of betting companies being a primary source of income. I think it's kind of blue chip Gulf companies and etc. that are going to really help, and major companies like Adidas who are going to help Newcastle drive revenues forward. And the more they can offer to commercial partners, whether that's in the stadium or whatever, is going to be important. So I think we're probably going to. I think the next phase will be trying to aid commercial revenue by in changing the infrastructure and investing in St James's Park and trying to find more ways to bring in commercial partners, and they'll be able to do that with the companies they've already got in their portfolio.
Yeah, I think people are waiting as well to see whether there will be a training kit sponsor or even a training ground sponsor. And then as time goes on, maybe even a renaming a deal at St James's Park, or indeed maybe a new stadium, because at the moment that, especially the training kit and the training ground stuff, that is one of the big criticisms laid at the door of the owners and the board is, why haven't we seen this? They're releasing several different bits of kit and training kits in previous months, but still without a sponsor. And it's those sort of deals which can really help a club go from 250 million up to north of maybe 400 million over time.
Sometimes the problem lies in so the reason why Chelsea haven't got a sponsor this season is because the offers on the table were less than what they felt the actual kind of the inventory was worth. So if you take a lesser amount, you run the risk of hobbling yourself in the market. So I wonder whether they are trying to ride that one out and then maybe ask for a significant amount of money for training, because training kit sponsorship is lucrative. So, but would it be more lucrative with the club making strides and adding big players whether it's this summer, following summer, than it would have been in the current market? Because usually sign these deals for 4 or 5 years. So I wonder whether they've got bigger plans to really grow the clubs in stature. So then they'd be able to ask for significantly more from those type of sponsorships.
You've mentioned other changes to come. I'm going to read you a tweet out from a popular Newcastle United fan account. And before I do, I think this account has got it wrong, but I'll read it out and see if I'm right in that thinking. And then you can go into a bit more detail, Dave. So in June, PSR rules which allow maximum losses of 105 million over 3 seasons will be replaced by SCR, which allows net spend on player sales to be 85% of revenue. Castle's revenue for 22-23 was 250 million, meaning a spend of 213 million. Now, a lot of people in the comments said you've got that a bit wrong. It also includes various other things. Is that, because it's got a lot of traction, is that incorrect?
Without seeing the numbers, I mean, the 23-24 are estimates at the moment. So without seeing the kind of cold hard numbers before me, I wouldn't like to say yes or no. But my understanding is Newcastle, I mean, initially, you look at this squad cost ratio, clubs have, I think it was 90, then it was, in the UEFA, with UEFA it worked as 90, 80, and then you have to get to 70. So the Premier League is going to sit around 85%, of which Newcastle are probably hovering around that figure at present. But it's going to be less for clubs that qualify for European competitions. So with Newcastle having one eye on that, that's going to be around 70%. So they know that if they want to be regular fixtures in European competition, they're going to have to. It's not going to be driving down the wage bill, because guess what? They need better players, so that wage bill is going to have to go up, as it has done the past financial year. What they have to do is bring in more money from prize money. They have to bring in more money from commercial in order to kind of offset this. So I think that I don't think Newcastle are going to have an issue with this new squad cost ratio. I think they fall within the parameters of it. A couple of years ago, they were, along with kind of Leicester, they were very close to kind of 100%. So if you adopt this model for the Championship, some clubs are operating at 125%, revenue against what they're spending on wages, and that's just completely unsustainable. Now Newcastle have addressed that because they've raised commercial revenue significantly. So wage bill for just looking at some of the figures here. So for 2022-23 was about 187 million. That was up from 170 the previous year. Some estimates of around 215 million for the current year. So that would be an increase of about 28 million. That seems correct, but there was a significant amount of money, extra money from broadcasting, which came in. There was a reduction in match day income because of domestically there was fewer money available. So, but they did have European money to factor into that. So, and there's a big rise in commercials. So I think Newcastle are very much heading in the direction in pretty much all of the key areas to ensure that they are compliant with not only the current PSR regulations in its final year, but also SCR. But they're not going to have an issue. But what they will have, like I said, is have one eye on is making sure that they are compliant with this 70% for clubs that qualify for Europe on a regular basis, because that is more problematic, and I don't think they're close to that ratio yet.
So is the squad cost ratio going to run alongside PSR, or is it replacing it?
Replacing it, we've also got kind of salary, kind of soft salary caps in place, haven't we? So PSR, as we know, it has been, I think it's been much maligned, and I think as when the Premier League introduced it, we didn't, the numbers weren't, no one was really hemorrhaging that much cash. Now they are. The money went up, but everyone just spent way more than they could afford. The cost of competing has gone ever higher. So, this is the final year. This financial year is the last, the final year of PSR, and squad cost ratio is what we're going to have moving forward. So, I think many clubs are be pleased to see the back of it. Newcastle definitely, Everton most definitely, same for Forest, and clubs like that. So. Aston Villa, etc. So I think, this is the final financial year which will be taken into account. But points deductions would still apply for this final year here. So this runs, Newcastle's financial year runs to the end of June. So there could still be points deductions which occur into next season. But from next season, they will be judged on their squad cost ratio. So as I said, they're not going to be wanting to reduce the wage bill. You look at United, that's kind of what they are wanting to do, because they've got some huge players on big wages there who aren't contributing. What Newcastle want to do is encourage wage bill growth alongside revenue growth to ensure they're kind of remaining sustainable.
So do you think Newcastle will welcome the change to the squad cost ratio, and B, more importantly, I guess, for our viewers and listeners, are in a good position to take advantage of the change?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the last 2 years have been really, really good work from the club to ensure they could have really got carried away with the Champions League season. It was a great season to qualify, but too much needed to be done in terms of spend to turn that Champions League qualifying side into one that definitely qualified the following year. There was significant additions that were needed around the edges. There was a poor year for some clubs, which had to be taken into account. Liverpool had a pretty torrid campaign that year. Chelsea was still in the throes of their ownership change, and they kind of failed miserably. So I think it was a wise move, maybe not a completely popular move, because people want to see. They think that people want to build from a position of strength, don't they? But I don't think Newcastle have really fallen away. They're still there. I think last season was a bit more of a struggle, obviously, but this year they look good again. They look like a club that has stability, and that isn't particularly. That's not commonplace in across the Premier League at the moment. You've got clubs scrambling for identity and to try and be relevant and to jumping through managers. I think the England job going away settles things down for Eddie Howe and stuff like that. So I think this summer we'll start to see the wheels turn again after a couple of summers of inactivity. I'm not saying that it's going to be going out and just frivolously spending, but I think the idea is keep the best players, invest in the wage bill. I think we'll see contract extensions swallow up a lot, and that's another thing people have to take into account, is that there's probably going to be a few big contract extensions that are going to be needed in order to stave off interest. So the likes of Isak, etc. I know he hasn't signed that long ago, but the club will be thinking, well, his output probably will deserve a wage rise in the not too distant future, and that has to be factored into the cost, just as transfer costs would be. So no, I think that there'll be a couple of big additions, but I don't think it's going to be kind of open checkbook time. But I think they'll be in a good position.
And do you think maybe that's why talk of a new contract for Aleksandar Isak has been put on the back burner a little bit, and maybe they are waiting for maybe the change in rules and then the new accounting period as well to kick in?
Yeah, definitely, because I think they know that they've got they don't need to accept anything before the end of June, and you look at the kind of clubs who would be in for him, and there won't be anyone sniffing around from Spain now, because there's been their money's gone elsewhere in more recent times, and obviously the focus in Madrid is for someone like Alexander-Arnold this summer. I think that United aren't a consideration, and that's a big thing when you have some big clubs which aren't considerations. The Chelsea project, I'm not entirely sure what's enticing about that Chelsea project. You look at Arsenal, they are the kind of the annual also rans, aren't they? So there's no guarantee of Champions League football, of a title win, and you look at the players that are being added. Yeah, very good, but they seem to reach this ceiling consistently. Whereas Newcastle, no one really knows the Newcastle ceiling. I mean, Liverpool aren't going to pay the money to get as much as Liverpool fans would love, I'm sure, to Alexander Isak to be at Anfield. That's not going to happen. They wouldn't pay that kind of money to get him out of there. So I think that they probably find themselves in a position of strength to be able to offer a deal and be confident that he would stay, because ultimately the club's heading in a good direction. No one knows really the limit on the ceiling. The conversations now will be, around an Isak contract extension will undoubtedly centre on not only money. They'll be able to pay an extension for the player. That's not a problem. It will be about, fine, if I'm staying here for another 5 years, what does my future look like? What does the investment in the summer look like? What does the investment in the following summer look like? Are we going to be serious challenges for the Champions League and for the title? And he'll want the answers to those questions to be yes. Now, in order to get to a position where you can offer contract extensions to your best players who are coveted by the biggest clubs, you have to be able to offer them these genuine options. And I think in creating that financial headroom ahead of this summer and the following summer, I think they're going to be able to, in a position to be able to say yes with some confidence.
It goes back to this January, doesn't it? Like you say, they're making the financial headroom. But a lot of fans are saying we're there. If Newcastle United sell Miguel Almiron, for example, and it's rumoured it might cost around 11, 12 million pounds, and they don't go and get a replacement, my co-host on the podcast, Aaron Stokes, said it'd be unfathomable that happens. But again, looking at the bigger picture, it kind of shows that Eddie Howe, Paul Mitchell, they're in a really difficult position because there's no way they'd want to leave Eddie Howe short by not bringing in a replacement for Miguel Almiron. But at the same time, as you've already mentioned, January is a volatile market. You often pay over the top. There is the so-called Newcastle United tax. And then you have the concern that if we go and spend 25, 30 million on this right winger, and it's probably going to be double that to get someone absolutely brilliant. You do want an upgrade on Jacob Murphy as well. We don't want to be getting to the last week of June, potentially having to sell Bruno or Lewis Miley, heaven forbid. We don't want to be in the same position that we were last June.
They would have had to spend an enormous amount of money to get a good winger in who was, a genuine. When they're looking for replacements now, they aren't like for like replacements. They're looking for considerable upgrades on the players they have because they don't operate an enormous squad. They're looking for significant upgrades. So if you look at what, so some of the wingers have gone for this January. So there hasn't been many, but Kvaratskhelia from Napoli, for instance, that's 70 million with a lot of add-ons included, which could take it closer to kind of 80 or 90. It's a lot of money to spend in January on a winger. Yes, there are other options out there, but clubs aren't wanting to sell in January and they're asking for a lot of money. And unless you think they can be the difference maker, then you're not going to, you're probably not going to act. I think keeping your powder dry till the summer it's maybe not a popular option, but I think it is probably wise. And if they can get some money for Almiron and feel they have enough in the building to cover his output between now and the end of the season, I think his book value's already accounted for because he's been there for such a period of time. That's just profit for them. Again, it's more money in the till to be able to spend in the coming summer on a player who could be, significantly impactful for years to come.
And you mentioned earlier in the show about amortization as well. Can you just explain that a little bit further? Because I think sometimes that can get a little bit confusing or can be forgotten about when it comes to signing players. So can you just talk to us about spreading that cost, over a certain amount of time and how that can be a benefit to clubs?
Yeah, so basically it's when you sign a player, the guaranteed sum, not including the add-ons, because those are accounted for as and when clauses are hit through exceptional items in a balance sheet. So that guaranteed sum is spread over the length of a contract. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the annual sum you will pay, because some clubs pay all in one go. Some clubs play in installments, and that always comes down to cash flow. So sometimes when you see, for instance, recently the holdco of Newcastle United allocated more shares to create, I think about 12.5 million, the most recent one. Now that is not for use in the transfer market. Sometimes these things are needed to meet transfer obligations that are coming up, so payments for players. But amortization is just the basic way of accounting for the signing of players in a club's financial statement. So, it's just transfer guaranteed sum divided by a number of years on a contract. Now, with every year the player stays there, part of that, so part of that sum is removed from what's known as his book value. So in Almiron's case, he's been there over and above his initial contract length, so he no longer holds a book value for Newcastle United because he's been accounted for, which means anything they sell him for now is profit. When you are selling a player who still has a book value, you only realise the profit over and above what remains on his book value. So, for some players, if they sign a player after, want to move him on after a year, then they're going to have to sell him for, have to take into account that they're going to have to make, over and above what what remains on his contract or his book value. So that's basically how it works. It doesn't take into account how much of a player's fee's been paid off, because for many of those players, their transfer fee's been accounted for, or not accounted for, but certainly paid off. But it's just a way of kind of showing in the books that these players have been signed, and that's basically it. So for homegrown players, so players out of the academy, there's a reason why Chelsea have managed to do so well in terms of staving off some PSR issues, is because they've managed to play a trade really effectively, because the amount of players that came out of their Cobham Academy, who didn't hold a book value because they were already Chelsea's players, who they kind of homegrown players who came through the system, has raised huge amounts of money. So Conor Gallagher, etc., has allowed them to realise kind of pure profit.
It's really interesting. I guess one of the other questions being asked about PSR and linking to Newcastle is the fact that fans are looking around and seeing some teams being able to spend or looking like they want to be spending. So you've got likes of West Ham reportedly in for John Duran for £57 million, although that's probably going to get rejected because Villa want closer to 100 million. Villa have signed at least one player this January. I know it was only for about £6 or £7 million, so not a huge amount of money, but they're still spending. And Forest have gone in with a bid of, I think, 22 million for Wissa from Brentford. And a lot of Newcastle United fans are saying, well, wait there, if they're in the market and putting bids in for certain players, and why aren't Newcastle United? Is it a case that their cycles are different, or obviously their numbers will be different? But it was only in the summer that Villa had to sell their star man to Juventus to stave off a potential PSR breach.
Well, Villa are operating now this season with a little bit of room for manoeuvre, not much, but they're in the Champions League, so they've got they've got 4 additional games, and they're doing well in the Champions League, so they're pretty much nailed on, I think, to qualify for the next stage. So I think already they're probably on course to earn more than what Newcastle did from when they were in the so obviously Newcastle were in it before it went to its revamped league format. So if they're signing a player for 6 or 7 million and that transfer fee is amortized over a period of 5 years or so, it's not a huge amount to take into account in that financial year when they know they've been able to account for that cost in other areas. So in the case of West Ham, it's an interesting one. Be interesting to see their accounts when they come out. One of the big things for them will be ensuring that they stave off any threat of relegation and etc. And while I don't think that they're going to go down, I think Duran is. I mean, he's one of those players. He's an interesting one, John Duran, because he's obviously a hugely talented player that doesn't really get the minutes he craves at Aston Villa, yet he's coveted across Europe. Yet they won't let him out of the building. I think that's a case of them thinking he is the kind of player that will definitely see them over the line between now and the end of the season, and also enables them to grow, further from there and ensure that they don't have the same kind of issues that they've had this season. So yeah, but clubs are in different cycles. Forest are also looking at the moment, thinking we're going to have far more money to spend next season because we're going to have a huge increase in our merit payments from this year. So the Premier League dishes out merit payments based on where a football team finishes. So last year for Forest, I think they made 6 or 7 million from their merit payment from the domestic and international media rights. This coming year, it's going to be more like 30 odd million. So all these have to be taken into account. Whereas Newcastle's will be still fairly marginal. It might increase by 3 or 4 million, but it's going to be fairly marginal. Forest is going to be weighty. So yeah, there's reasons. Clubs have different reasons, and they are in different parts of their cycle because competitive success is different compared to the previous season, etc. Whereas Newcastle are very much, this is the model, this is the strategy, this is what we're sticking with. Kind of like it or lump it, but the end goal is to be in a position where they can invest sustainably in sustainable success. I mean, success is great, but if it arrives once every 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that can be frustrating. So they want to build something which is long lasting, because I do think they're here for very much the long haul.
And talking of building, plenty of speculation over St James's Park and whether Newcastle United will stay and expand the stadium or whether they will look to move elsewhere within the city centre. We've seen other clubs, of course, make big money moves, Tottenham, Arsenal. I mean, how important is it? And this sounds like a really daft question because it's so important, but how important is it to get that move right, not just in terms of obviously the feeling within the fan base, but from a commercial point of view as well?
It's enormous because this is kind of you're future-proofing a football club here, because things are going to. The Premier League's had it very good for very long in terms of domestic and international broadcast rights. But while they trumpeted the most recent cycle of 6.7 billion as being a big success, they sold more games to achieve that, and it was over 4 years. So per game, the value has actually decreased, and that's going to be a trend. So it's anti-Darwinian to think these things go up forever. So clubs can only do so much commercially. There's only so much shirt sponsorships you can sell. There's only so much inventory you can sell in terms of advertising hoardings or space on the website or those type of things, training gear. There has to be other ways of doing it. So Everton will benefit in the coming years from Bramley-Moore Dock. I mean, they've had so many years of pain, but Goodison Park was no longer fit for purpose for a football club in a modern age. St James's Park is iconic. It is a kind of a behemoth of a venue that sits in. I mean, I love it because it sits in the city centre. It is it's the kind of the best location, the best located football ground in major football ground in the UK. It's kind of really is one, out on its own in terms of that, and absolutely, it's part of its charm. However, what is good about its charm also is what can be a hindrance in terms of allowing it to find other ways of growing. So if you look at what United have got planned on the land at Old Trafford, so there's a huge regeneration project going on around there. There has to be the land. If the Newcastle do choose to redevelop or remain the same or find a new place, has to be the land around to develop for kind of ancillary development. So all sorts. So you look at Spurs, they've got the F1 karting experience underneath Spurs' stadium. They've got the pitches retractable, and an NFL pitch comes in. On one side of the stadium, you've got normal changing rooms for the Premier League. On the other side of the stadium, you've got changing rooms which are wider because they're allowed to house the NFL. Why can't Newcastle, if they're building a new stadium, if that was the plan, they should be looking to be a venue which can be a venue really for the North that brings some of these American sports to different markets. And London shouldn't have the monopoly over all these things. There needs to be ways to bring, or they should be able to be a venue which houses huge, boxing events or music concerts, etc. Has to be other ways of earning money. They need to find ways to improve the hospitality so they earn more money from that to create. And it seems really, we're talking about. I mean, I'm a Chester fan, so I still go and stand on the terraces because what I continue to like about it is the antithesis of kind of the modern game, and that's my cross to bear because we're not a good football team, but it's part of my identity. So I absolutely understand that from the point of view of fans, particularly in Newcastle. When if you're living in and around the city, you're a Newcastle fan. It's no one's walking around, being Liverpool fans or Chelsea fans or United fans. Really, you're a Newcastle fan because it's identity. So it's a hard sell to, I think, for Newcastle more than most to make that change to a new stadium. But they're going to have to find a way to do more with the real estate they have, whether that's redevelopment and buying up some existing land around there. Now, I can't think off the top of my head what that looks like around the ground. I think it's fairly built up, is it not? I mean, there's not much scope for additional development around St James's Park because it's so close to the city centre, and I don't think that's really an option. So, can they do more with what they have? Sure, but maybe the city centre location is something which is a win. People don't like to have travel links are a big problem for some stadiums. If you build a stadium which is out of town, you've got to get people there. That increases the cost, and sometimes it can be soulless. Maybe redeveloping the stadium and turning it into what we've just talked about, but with its kind of USP being that it's in the city centre in one of the UK's most kind of lively and bustling city centres. Maybe that's kind of its unique selling point. But they're going to have to do more. They're going to have to raise matchday revenue, and commercial revenue will go hand in hand with that. What United have planned for Old Trafford is going to be a real problem. So I think Newcastle are almost in a similar situation to Chelsea, because they can't, there's difficulty for Chelsea in moving there because, or redevelopment, because there's, the trust owns the pitch, etc. So they can't do much with it, and it's very expensive to do development in London. When Tottenham did it, I think Daniel Levy spoke previously about saying if Tottenham were doing this stadium now, it may not have happened to the level it did because interest rates weren't the same. The cost of doing it was it would have been cost prohibitive now. So Newcastle are going to have to find something cost effective, but also which properly gives them the opportunity to challenge in terms of match day revenue. So Liverpool stayed where they are, and they've rebuilt Anfield effectively, and raised commercial revenues through that, and their match day revenue for the coming years going to tip over 100 million for the first time. Newcastle may adopt something similar, but they're definitely going to have to. The bricks and mortar is something which is within the control of the PIF and what they can do with it. So that's something they'll absolutely have to address.
We'll wait and see what happens with that. We will, of course, keep you up to date on the future of St James's Park. Just before we get into the final couple of questions, reminder that this episode is sponsored by NORD VPN. Hit the link in the podcast description box to get a discounted offer exclusive to our listeners and viewers of the Everything is Black and White podcast. Keep yourself protected and help support the podcast. There is always a fear, Dave, that a big sale will have to come. We've seen down the years that Liverpool, for example, have done it, selling Coutinho and raising 80 plus million and reinvesting it really well. Declan Rice went to Arsenal and West Ham, reinvested that money, which looked really well. Hasn't quite gone to plan this season. That fear is real for Newcastle United, isn't it? And when you look at their sellable assets that you'd happily see move on, there's not a core value there like Liverpool had, where they can raise 25 million or so. There's limited players to sell. How real is that threat that a big money sale will have to come, but it'll come short-term pain, but long-term gain?
I think, given the way the market's going, who knows what anyone's worth now. I think there's a real reluctance from the PIF to engage in that, because it sends the signals out that we're just a club which is a stepping stone, whereas that's what they're keen to avoid, I think. However, if someone comes in with stupid money to kind of take, I don't know, Alexander Isak off your hands, what they're going to have to look at is, can we make up the goal contributions or what he brings to the table in terms of goals somewhere else, as well as being able to add in other areas which would improve our overall competitiveness in the league. And these are the kind of questions they have to ask. But I really think there's going to be a huge reluctance, largely because of optics as well. I think they don't want to be seen as a club that sells. Now, players can force the hand of clubs. Of course they can. If they're unhappy, they want out. But also, I think there was a moment in time where Newcastle might just avoid some of this happening, because is Arsenal the huge step up that that kind of seems to be suggested it is? They haven't won a league title for a long time. They've never won a Champions League. I don't know whether he's any closer winning a Champions League going to Arsenal. But then you also have Barcelona aren't the Barcelona that used to swoop in and take everyone's plays like they did with Coutinho a few years ago, which kind of Liverpool invested in signing Alisson Becker and Virgil van Dijk, two players who ultimately would go on to be completely transformative to what they do. So Barcelona aren't an issue. There won't be an issue for a few years to come. Real Madrid can be, but then again, it's their interest doesn't seem to be heading in that direction. United aren't the United of yesteryear, And they've got Jim Ratcliffe there, who is cutting costs and wanting to see the wage bill driven down and spend on players driven down. He wants to sign players at a lower market value. The Chelsea project is in its final cycle now, I think. So they did the huge spend. They're still close to the limit with everything, but I think they've done the big overhaul of players, which they wanted to see. Whether or not they have the room to, I don't think they have the financial wriggle room to add someone like Isak, certainly not in the short term. And City have just signed Haaland for 10 years. Are they in the market for another front player who would challenge his place? I don't think they are. So, and Liverpool aren't that type of club to spend over the odds. So I think Newcastle, like I said before, they're going to be in a position to leverage. If they need to sell a big player, it will only be done if the funds are going to be reinvested in improving not only that area. So they can sell a big player, but then move into and be able to and spot an opportunity in the market where they can sign someone even more impactful for less money, who is younger, the profile is younger, on a longer deal. Or you address 2 or 3 areas of the team which need doing, which overall improves some of the parts for the football club. So if there's a deal to be done and it improves Newcastle, they will. If it's just to improve the financial situation, I think that ship has almost sailed, thankfully. I think they are moving to a place where they're starting to get more comfortable what they can and can't do, and they've got enough quality players. They've finally got world-class players in the building, and it's about building out from around those players. Now I think they'll be more focused on.
Our fans, our viewers and listeners, Newcastle fans will be delighted with your answer there, Dave. Just to finish off then, can you just once again sum up not only Newcastle's present position, but also maybe your prediction for the summer to come as well?
They will be PSR compliant for the final year of PSR. I think they'll be under the limit or on the limit at least of the squad cost ratio. I don't know if there's any punishment for them coming down the tracks. I do think that they will be an outgoing or 2 required between now and before the end of their financial year, just to ensure that they aren't chasing their tail or run the risk of of that potential heavy loss that they're allowed. Could be up to 80 million or so that they are allowed. Doesn't mean to say they'll lose that. They could, they could lose far less than that. But I think that they may look to move on some fringe players. Who they choose to do, I don't know, because there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of viable options. They might find some way of making that work before the end of the financial year. But I do think a couple of players need to. 1 or 2 players will probably exit. I think the summer brings better things. I think they will engage in a more meaningful and robust manner on 1 or 2 big targets. I don't think there'll be lots of players arriving. I think they'll seek to keep hold of what they have through contract extensions, and also maybe we might see 1 major addition with 1 or 2 to complement the squad. But I think in the main it'll be about making improvements to the squad in a sustainable fashion, but also in a meaningful way.
So there we go, ladies and gents. Maybe a quiet January to come, but possibly an exciting summer ahead. Thank you to Dave for providing his insight into Newcastle United's finance. We will get Dave back on as well when the accounts are released, which should be sometime this month. So we'll give him a couple of days to read through the numbers, and we'll get him back on to explain it all. But in the meantime, for myself, enjoy the rest of the week. Make sure you hit thumbs up on the YouTube. Make sure you leave us a rating and review on the podcast app as well. Click the link in the podcast description box for your special offer on your NORD VPN plan. And for myself, I will be back on Thursday with the match preview alongside John Gibson. Until then, have a lovely afternoon.